Every Wednesday, I got the same seat in the same laundromat, and the old woman next to me kept leaving folded paper fortunes that somehow described my life more accurately than I ever could. I first noticed her because she never seemed to do laundry. That sounds strange, I know, but laundromats have a rhythm to them. People come in with baskets, bags, detergent, coins, and that tired look that says they'd rather be anywhere else. They load the machines, sit down, check their phones, fold clothes, and leave. It's one of the few places in the world where strangers accidentally learn each other's routines just by showing up at the same time every week. I had my own routine at the time. Every Wednesday after work, I stopped at the Maple Street laundromat, sat in the same cracked vinyl chair by the vending machine, and washed whatever didn't fit into the rest of my life. I worked long hours at a small insurance office downtown, lived alone in a studio apartment with a sink that leaked when it rained, and had gotten so used to doing things on autopilot that even the laundromat started to feel like one more room in my apartment. The woman was already there the first time I really noticed her. She was always in the same seat too, one row over from mine, close enough that we shared the little table between us but far enough that it would have felt rude to stare. She was tiny and neat, with silver hair pinned back in a careful twist, a tan coat that never seemed to change, and a woven handbag she kept on her lap like it contained something fragile. She never brought a laundry basket. I had never once seen her put anything into a washer or a dryer. She just sat there, watching the room with the calm, patient expression of someone who had all the time in the world. The first note appeared on a Wednesday in early November. I remember because the machine across from me was making a horrible rattling sound, and I was wondering if it would eat my only good pair of work slacks. I got up to check on it, and when I came back, there was a folded square of paper tucked into the empty seat beside mine. No one else was near it. No one had spoken to me. I looked around instinctively, but the old woman was just sitting there, hands folded, eyes on the spinning drum of her washer. Or at least I assumed she was watching the washer. It was hard to tell with her. I picked up the paper. It was folded into a perfect little triangle, the kind of shape you make absent-mindedly in a notebook while pretending to pay attention to a lecture. Inside was a fortune cookie-style message written in neat, slanted blue ink. "You are waiting for something you are afraid will arrive." I actually laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny, because it was irritatingly accurate. I had been waiting for a call about a promotion I wasn't sure I even wanted. Waiting for a text back from a woman I had dated for 6 months, and who had recently started taking longer and longer to respond. Waiting for my father to stop being disappointed in me, even though he'd been disappointed for years, and neither of us had ever said it out loud. The note had no name on it, no signature, just that sentence. I looked over at the old woman again, but she didn't turn her head. She simply lifted one hand and adjusted the cuff of her coat with the kind of casual motion that felt too deliberate to be accidental. I folded the note back up and put it in my pocket. I told myself she had probably left it for someone else by mistake, maybe one of the regulars. Maybe the laundromat was a place where people did odd little things like that. The whole evening felt strange for about 5 minutes, and then life got in the way. I forgot about it by the time I got home. The next Wednesday, there was another note. This one appeared while I was loading socks into the washer. I set the detergent down, reached for a stray shirt that had fallen off the basket, and by the time I turned back around, a second folded square of paper was sitting on top of my jeans. No one had walked past me. No one had touched the table. I looked over and again the old woman was there, hands folded, gaze lowered toward her lap. If she noticed me looking, she gave no sign. The note said, "You rehearse conversations that will never happen." That one hit harder. I had spent the entire week replaying a conversation with my ex Jenna in my head, not the breakup itself, the aftermath, the version where she changed her mind, or explained herself better, or admitted she still missed me. I kept imagining different things I could say if I saw her again, as if there were a correct script waiting somewhere if I just thought hard enough. I put the note in my wallet this time. The week after that, another one appeared. "You still think being needed is the same as being loved." I stopped laughing then. I was not a superstitious person. I wasn't even especially imaginative, but there was no denying the pattern, and the pattern had begun to feel personal in a way that made me uncomfortable. The notes were too precise to be random, too specific to be generic advice. Whoever was writing them wasn't guessing, they were observing. The problem was that I couldn't figure out how. We never spoke. At least, not in the beginning. I would sit down, start a load, check my phone, stare into space, and at some point a note would appear beside me. Sometimes I'd look down and it was already there. Sometimes I'd leave the seat for 30 seconds and come back to it. Once I was certain I had watched the table the entire time, and still it was there when I looked again. Every Wednesday, one new fortune. Every Wednesday, one sentence that felt like it had been peeled off my brain and flattened onto paper. I started keeping them in a shoebox at home. At first I thought of them as a strange game, then I started reading them before bed, then I began to dread them. Every note seemed to see a little farther into me than I had expected, like someone was standing quietly behind the eyes I used to look at myself. One said, "You keep your keys in the same bowl because you are afraid of arriving anywhere without proof you belong there." That one made me sit on my bed for 10 full minutes. Another said, "You apologize too quickly because silence from others feels like punishment." That one made me angry. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was. I decided I was going to speak to her the following Wednesday. I didn't know what I would say. I just knew I was done pretending this was coincidence. If she had a reason for leaving the notes, I wanted to hear it. If she was messing with me, I wanted to know that too. So that night, I arrived earlier than usual. The laundromat was nearly empty when I got there. One woman was folding towels in the corner. A teenager was asleep with headphones in near the vending machine. The old woman was already in her seat as always, but this time I sat down before I started a load and waited for her to look at me. It took a while. When she finally did, she didn't seem surprised. I said, "Are you leaving those notes for me?" She studied my face for a moment, then nodded once. "Why?" I asked. Her mouth twitched almost into a smile, but not quite. "Because you read them," she said. That was such a strange answer that I had to blink. "I mean, why is you leaving them at all?" She reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded white tissue. She dabbed the corner of one eye, though it didn't seem like she was crying. "Because," she said, "you never look like anyone who is being told the truth anywhere else." I stared at her. I'm not sure what I expected her to say, but it wasn't that. I said, "Do I know you?" She didn't answer immediately. For a second, I thought she might pretend not to have heard me. Instead, she looked at me with a kind of careful sadness that made me uneasy. "No," she said, then after a pause, "Not yet." I frowned. What does that mean? But she had already looked away. That was the first time I felt something cold move under the surface of the whole thing. Not fear exactly. More like the sensation that I had stepped into a hallway and only now realized there were doors on both sides. The next note waited for me when I came back from the restroom. "You are not here by accident." I stood there in the middle of the laundromat, holding the paper so tightly it nearly tore. When I looked up, the old woman had shifted her seat just enough to face me directly. Not fully, just enough that I knew she was watching. I crossed the room and sat down across from her. "Who are you?" I asked. She folded her hands over her handbag. "Someone who remembers more than you do." "About what?" "About this place." I looked around. "It's a laundromat." "Is it?" I didn't know what to say to that. She reached into her handbag again and took out a third note, already folded, and placed it on the table between us without opening it. "This one is for later," she said. "Later when?" "When you remember the hallway." I stared at the note, then back at her. "What hallway?" She looked almost amused by my confusion, but there was no cruelty in it, just recognition. "You'll know when it comes back." Then she stood up, collected her things, and walked out before I could say anything else. I sat there for a long time after she left, the unopened note in front of me like a dare. When I finally unfolded it, it said, "The first time you met me, you were 8 years old and carrying a plastic dinosaur in your coat pocket." I felt the room tilt. That was impossible. And yet before I could stop myself, I remembered a blue plastic dinosaur with one missing eye, the kind you get in a cheap toy bag at the grocery store. I remembered holding it in my hand while my mother argued with someone near a row of machines. I remembered the smell of detergent, the hum of fluorescent lights, and a woman with silver hair asking me if I wanted a mint. My breath caught in my chest. The memory didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, like something surfacing through thick water. The laundromat had been different then, older, less polished. My mother had worked late nights after my father left, and she used to bring me with her while she washed work clothes and scarves and the one good jacket she owned. I had sat on a bench and played with that dinosaur while she talked to a woman with kind eyes and a calm voice. The woman had been the same old woman. I could see it now in flashes, not clear enough to make sense of everything, but enough to make my stomach turn with recognition. I had known her. Or maybe I had only seen her enough times to feel like I knew her. The next Wednesday, I waited for her before sitting down. When she arrived, she seemed to know I would be there. She gave me a small nod and took her seat beside the machine with the noisy bearing. I didn't bother pretending I was there for laundry at first. I just walked over and sat down. "I remembered," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she asked, "What did you remember?" You, I said, the laundromat, my mother, I was a kid. She nodded once, as if that confirmed something she had already suspected. You used to come here every Tuesday, she said. Your mother worked evenings. You liked to line up the dryer sheets like dominoes and knock them over when no one was watching. I stared at her. That's real, I whispered. Yes. The feeling that came over me then was so strange it's hard to describe. Not relief, not fear, something between the two with a little grief mixed in, because the memory was real enough to hurt. I asked, why don't I remember more? Her expression changed. Because you were taught not to. By who? She looked down at her hands. By the people who thought forgetting would keep you safe. I felt my pulse in my throat. That makes no sense. It will. She reached into her bag and held out another note. This one was not folded like the others. It was folded into a little square envelope shape, and my name was written on the outside in the same blue ink. I didn't take it right away. What is this? I asked. Something you left behind. I frowned. I never left you anything. You did, she said. I opened the note carefully. Inside was a single sentence. When you are ready, ask about the red suitcase. I looked up sharply. What red suitcase? For the first time since I'd known her, the old woman looked afraid. Not of me, of the answer. Aren't you going to tell me? I asked. She took a slow breath, then said, you need to go home and find the box under your bed first. I actually laughed once, because that was the sort of thing that sounds ridiculous until it doesn't. What box? She stood up then, and I had the sudden feeling the conversation was over whether I liked it or not. The one you've been avoiding, she said. I got to my feet too. You can't just say something like that and leave. She turned back to me, and for the first time her face held something almost like pity. You've been leaving yourself clues for years, she said softly. I'm only helping you read them. Then she left me there. I spent the rest of the night folding and refolding the note in my hand, while the washers spun and the dryers hummed around me. I went home with the uneasy certainty that my life had been missing a page, maybe several, and that the old woman had somehow found the place where the torn edges still fit. I barely slept. The next morning before work, I crawled under my bed and found the box. It was a shoebox wrapped in an old scarf and shoved into the far corner where I almost never looked. Dust coated the top of it so thickly I had to wipe it away with my sleeve. My name was written on the lid in faded marker, but not my adult name, the one I hadn't used since I was 11. My hands started shaking immediately. I sat on the floor for a full minute before opening it. Inside were 5 things. A plastic dinosaur missing one eye. A bus transfer from 2004. A cracked photograph of my mother standing in front of the laundromat. A key with a red plastic tag. And a folded paper fortune. I picked up the fortune first. The handwriting was mine. It said, if she gives you the red suitcase note, it means you are close enough to remember the truth. I had to put the paper down. For a long time I just stared at the box and tried to breathe normally. Then I unfolded the photograph. My mother was standing in front of the laundromat entrance, one hand on my shoulder, both of us looking directly at the camera. Beside the glass door was the old woman, younger then, not much older than my mother, holding a shopping bag and smiling as if she had been asked to stand there by chance. The back of the photo had a date written on it. And beneath the date in the same blue ink were 3 words. Don't forget Ruth. Ruth. The old woman finally had a name. And with the name came another memory, sudden and sharp. Not complete, but enough. Ruth had not been a stranger. She had been a friend of my mother, or maybe something more like a sister in the way people become family when life is hard and small. She used to watch me while my mother worked late. She brought peppermints wrapped in paper and folded paper cranes from old receipts. She knew where the vending machine rattled if you kicked it just right, and she laughed whenever I called the dryers the hot boxes. Then one day, something changed. I remembered my mother crying in the car. I remembered a red suitcase in the back seat. I remembered Ruth standing by the laundromat door, with a look on her face that was trying very hard not to be afraid. And I remembered, with terrible clarity, that I had been told never to mention her again. I sat there on the floor with the photo in my hand and the key in my lap and understood, all at once, that the old woman had not been writing fortunes about my present life. She had been trying to return my past to me, one sentence at a time. That Wednesday I went back to the laundromat before dark. Ruth was already there. She saw the way I was holding myself and knew immediately that I had found the box. I remembered the photo, I said before she could speak. She closed her eyes briefly, like someone hearing music after a long silence. And the suitcase, she asked. Not yet. Close enough, she said. I sat down beside her, no longer caring about being cautious. Tell me what happened. She looked at the spinning washer in front of her, then at my hands, then finally at my face. Your mother used to bring a red suitcase here, she said. Not for laundry, for hiding. I blinked. Hiding what? Ruth's mouth tightened. Letters, documents, money when she could manage it, things she didn't want your father to find. I stared at her. My father had been gone for years in my childhood, but not in the way I had always assumed. He wasn't dead. He was absent, then present in the ugliest way possible, then absent again. A man who drifted in and out like weather. A man who made my mother tense when his name came up. I had never had the full story, only fragments and warnings. Ruth continued, your mother and I used the laundromat as a meeting place because it was public. Safe. Nobody paid attention to two women talking over laundry. I said, why do I feel like there's something you're not telling me? She gave a sad little smile, because there is. I waited. She folded her hands around her handbag and said, the red suitcase was yours. The world went very still. My what? It was kept here for you. I stared at her. She spoke carefully, as though walking through old glass. Your mother made arrangements before she passed. There were things she wanted you to have when you were older. Things about your family, about your father, about why she trusted me with the notes. My stomach turned. You've been doing this the whole time. Ruth nodded. All these years? Yes. Why didn't you just tell me? Because you weren't ready to hear it, until you were ready to remember that you had already heard it once before. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. That made no sense, and somehow it made too much sense at the same time. Ruth reached into her handbag and pulled out one final folded note. This one was thicker than the others, and when she handed it to me, her fingers trembled slightly. This is the last one, she said. I unfolded it with shaking hands. Inside were 4 lines, written in my mother's handwriting. If you found Ruth's, then you're old enough now. The suitcase is not under the bed anymore. It was moved after the funeral. Ask your father where it went. I looked up so fast I nearly dropped the paper. My father. Ruth's face told me enough before she said anything. Yes, she said, he came for it. All the air left my lungs. I sat there in the laundromat with the fortune in my hand and understood, finally, why the notes had felt so unnervingly accurate, because they weren't telling me who I was now. They were pointing me toward who I had been before someone else decided I should forget. My father had taken the suitcase after the funeral. My mother had hidden things in it. Ruth had helped. And somewhere in all of that, there were truths about my childhood I had never been allowed to keep. I looked at Ruth, and for the first time since this started, she looked less like a mysterious old woman and more like a tired friend who had been carrying the weight of a promise too long. What was in the suitcase? I asked. She exhaled slowly. Your real name, she said, at least part of it. That was when I started crying. Not loud, not dramatically. Just the kind of tears that come when a person realizes they have been standing in the wrong version of their own life for years, and only now understand why the floor always felt uneven. Ruth didn't say anything. She just handed me a tissue from her bag and sat with me while the dryers hummed around us and the laundromat lights buzzed softly overhead. When I was finally able to speak, I asked, why me? Why did you keep leaving the notes instead of just telling me all this? She looked at me and said, because you needed to choose the truth for yourself. I wiped my face. That sounds like something people say when they don't know what else to say. She smiled a little, maybe, but it's also true. I was quiet for a while. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding since I found the box. Was my father the one who made me forget? Ruth's expression changed, and that was answer enough. He tried, she said, not in the obvious way, not with force, with stories, with silence, with telling you things over and over until they became the only version left. I felt cold again. She reached into her handbag one last time and pulled out a small, old address card. That's where he lives now, she said. If you want the rest, that's where you'll find it. I took the card. The handwriting on it was mine. At the bottom of the card, in the same blue ink, were 3 words I had no memory of writing. Don't go alone. That night I called my sister. Not because I wanted company, because I knew, suddenly and absolutely, that I could not do this part by myself. My sister Alina had been the one person in my family who never seemed completely comfortable with the stories we were told about our past. She had always asked better questions than I did. She was the one who remembered details I had forgotten, the one who used to say our father left holes in the air when he was around. We hadn't always been close, but we had become closer in adulthood, in that way siblings sometimes do when the family mythology starts to fall apart. I told her I had found something, and needed her to drive with me somewhere the next day. She didn't ask many questions. She just said, "I'll be there at 9. The address card led us to a small rental house on the edge of town. The whole drive there, I kept staring at the card and trying to remember writing the note on the back of it. I couldn't, but I also couldn't deny it. That was the worst part. Everything around the memory felt like it belonged to me and not to me at the same time. My father answered the door. He looked older than I expected and younger too, which is the strange way grief distorts people you haven't seen in years. He recognized me instantly, and I saw the moment he realized I wasn't there for something small. He stepped back without a word and let us in. The house was plain and tidy in that tense way some people live when they're trying very hard to keep the past from leaking through the walls. Alina stayed near the door. I didn't waste time. "I know about the suitcase," I said. His face changed. I saw panic first, then calculation, then that familiar cold distance he used to wear whenever the truth got too close. "I don't know what you think you know," he said. I held up the address card. "This is mine, I wrote it, or someone made me write it." He looked at it and went pale. Alina gave me a sharp glance, but I kept going. "Where is it?" He took a slow breath. "You shouldn't have come here." That's not an answer. Because there is no suitcase anymore. Ruth had warned me he'd say something like that. I asked, "What did you do with it?" He looked away. I said, "You took it after the funeral." His jaw tightened. "I was protecting you," he said. "From what?" "From the kind of life your mother was building for you." That sentence made me furious in a way I can't properly explain. She was building a life for me, I snapped, not whatever this was. He turned on me then, finally showing enough emotion to make himself look human. "You don't know what she was hiding from me." I looked at him hard. "Then tell me." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he walked to a hallway closet, opened it, and reached into a back corner behind a stack of folded blankets. He pulled out a flat metal box and carried it to the table. Inside was what was left of the red suitcase. Not the whole thing, just pieces. A torn lining, a broken zipper, a stack of letters tied with string, and a bundle of old papers so carefully wrapped they looked untouched for years. My breath caught. He had hidden it. Not destroyed it. Hidden it. I looked at him with such disgust I could barely speak. He didn't meet my eyes. The letters were addressed to my mother. Some were from Ruth. Some were from my father. One was from a lawyer. One was from someone named Miriam, a name I didn't know. And one was from my mother to me. I unfolded that one first. The letter was short, and the handwriting trembled at the edges. It said, "If you are reading this, then Ruth was right and your father has already tried to remake the story. Remember this, you were wanted before you were difficult, and loved before you were useful. The rest will hurt, but it will not change that." I had to put the paper down. Because that was the thing I had never known how to say out loud about myself, that being wanted and being loved were not the same. That I had spent so much of my life acting like usefulness was the closest thing to affection I'd ever get. The next letter was from Ruth, written years later, and it explained everything I had been circling without realizing it. My father had not simply left. He had tried to control the family after my mother became sick, and he had not liked the things she kept from him. The suitcase had contained documents relating to my mother's attempt to separate from him, along with records that clarified something about my birth certificate that I had never been told. He had hidden the suitcase because he believed I was better off without the truth. The truth, according to him, was too messy, too painful, too damaging. He had decided what version of my life was acceptable. And somewhere in that decision, my mother had made a choice of her own. She had used Ruth, the laundromat, and the notes as a way of leaving me a trail back to myself. I sat at my father's table with the suitcase remnants spread out in front of me and realized the fortunes had never been random at all. They had been breadcrumbs. Gentle, careful, personal little shoves toward the parts of my life he had hidden. I looked at the last stack of papers. At the very bottom was a folded note in my own handwriting. I didn't remember writing it, but the sentence was unmistakably mine. "If I ever ask you to explain my childhood, don't start with the easy version." I laughed then, but it came out broken. Alina stood beside me silently, reading over my shoulder. When she looked at me, I could tell she understood enough to know that the rest of the afternoon was going to hurt. My father tried to defend himself. He said he had done what he thought was best. He said people need stability. He said my mother was dramatic, Ruth was manipulative, memory was unreliable, and some stories only caused damage when dragged into the light. I listened to him say all of it, and all I could think was how familiar it sounded. How many times I had heard versions of that same speech in my life, from people who wanted me to stay small enough to manage. When he finally ran out of excuses, I asked him the one question that mattered most. Why did you take the suitcase if you thought it would hurt me? His answer was quiet. Because I wanted to be the one who told you when. That was the truth behind everything. Not love, not protection, control. A man who wanted to decide when I was ready to know myself. I left the house with the letters, the photograph from Ruth, and the last 3 fortunes tucked inside my coat pocket. I didn't shout, I didn't break anything, I didn't need to. Some things are ruined by revelation more completely than they could ever be by anger. Ruth was waiting at the laundromat the next Wednesday. I don't know how she knew I would come. Maybe because she knew me well enough by then. Maybe because some routines are just too old to break. I sat down beside her and handed her the first letter from my mother. She read it once, then closed her eyes. For a minute neither of us spoke. Then I asked, why did you keep doing this for so long? Ruth folded the letter carefully and handed it back to me. Because your mother asked me to keep the room open until you came for it, she said, and because sometimes a person can't carry the truth alone, so someone has to leave it somewhere patient. I glanced around the laundromat. The chairs were the same, the machines were the same, the neon sign in the window hummed softly above the door. Everything looked ordinary. And yet it no longer felt ordinary to me. I said, was any of it fortune-telling? Ruth gave a soft, tired smile. No, she said, just remembering people kindly enough to tell them the truth before they're ready to hear it. I looked at her for a long time. Then I laughed through the ache in my chest and said, you were leaving me therapy notes in a laundromat. She tilted her head. If you prefer, we can call them fortunes. I shook my head, smiling despite myself. The old woman reached into her handbag one last time and gave me a final folded paper. This is the last one, she said. I opened it. Inside were 4 words. Now tell your own. And that was the end of the old version of my life. Not because everything was suddenly fixed. It was. I still had years of untangling to do. I still had a father who tried to rewrite the past, a childhood full of missing pieces, and a family story that had been trimmed and pinned and softened into something far easier than the truth. But I also had the letters. I had the photo. I had Ruth's careful patience and my mother's voice in ink and the knowledge that some part of me had been trying to find this hallway for a very long time. So I started telling my own story. Slowly at first. To Alina, to a therapist, to myself, in notebooks and recordings and late-night conversations where I didn't have to make it sound neat. I stopped pretending that memory only mattered when it was complete. I stopped treating silence like peace. I stopped waiting for permission to know what had been mine all along. And every Wednesday, I kept going back to the laundromat. Sometimes Ruth was there. Sometimes she was. Sometimes there was a new note tucked into the seat beside mine. Sometimes there was. But when there was, I understood them differently now. Not as mysterious messages from a stranger. As small acts of care from someone who had spent years making sure I would eventually find my way back. The last note she ever left me said, "You were never hard to love, only hard to keep hidden." I still have that one. It sits in my desk drawer, folded twice, alongside the key with the red tag, the photo, and the letter from my mother. And every time I pass a laundromat with the lights on inside, I think of the old woman in the tan coat, sitting calmly beside the dryers, leaving paper fortunes for the person next to her who needed them most. Because that was Ruth's real gift. Not predicting the future. Helping people remember that their lives were always bigger than the story someone else tried to tell about them. And mine, finally, was my own.